Nothing? Do I have to turn up the volume, or is that okay? Yep. Turn up the volume?
What's that?
Turn up the volume, or is that okay?
That's fine.
Oh. Everybody can hear?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. So we're on chapter 9 continuing. Last week we finished a section of verses. Trying to find the page. It looks like we're right at the bottom in my text of 46 to 47. I'm going to read the first refrain. This is a standard refrain that's appearing between the verse sections. Read this in English and then maybe do the first verse tonight. So after the last section of verses ends with, thus come one knows the Dharma in this way, beholds the Buddha's body, or looks at, regards a Buddha's body. The text continues, at that time light passed through 100,000 worlds, and everywhere illumined 1,000,000 worlds to the east. It was also like this in the south, the west, north, the four intermediate directions, as well as above and below. Within each of those worlds were 1,000,000,000 Jambudvipas, reaching up to 1,000,000,000 ultimate form heavens, and all these were clearly revealed in this light. Just as in this place one could see, thus come one seated on his lotus flower treasury lion's throne, with bodhisattvas as many as 5 motes of dust in 10 Buddha lands, circumambulating him, so too in each of these billions of Jambudvipas, there were billions of thus come ones seated in the same way. Because of the spiritual power of the Buddha in each the 10 directions, there was a great bodhisattva who was accompanied by bodhisattvas to the number of 5 motes of dust in 10 Buddha lands, who came to the Buddha's place. Their names were Manjushri and others. They came from countries called golden-colored light and others, and Buddhas they served were called unmoving wisdom, thus come one, and others. At this time, in the presence of all those Buddhas, the voices of Manjushri bodhisattvas in all those places rang out in unison as they spoke these verses. And then if we can, we may look at the first verse tonight and just slowly recite it in Chinese. There's 4 lines. 如来最自在，超实无所以，就一切功德，度脱于诸有。Roughly translated, thus come one. I'm going to make these changes as we go along. We've already talked about why we might render it a, especially if you can see from the passage of text here tonight, you have, and the Avatamsaka is very clear about this, there's not just one world, even though that's how we usually think of things. There's worlds upon worlds. And there's not just one Buddha or thus come one. They are measureless and numerous. And there's not just one bodhisattva. For here, for example, the text says their names were Manjushri and others. And the others include all the bodhisattvas we might be familiar with, as well as bodhisattvas that we wouldn't be familiar with. This is not just to fulfill one of the functions of this sutra, which is literally, according to the preface, the understanding and expanding of the mind in all its states. The text is this Avatamsaka text is really to show, to elucidate the mind and all the states that arise from the mind. Of course, this is talking about our mind, but it's talking about mind in general as being the origin of the 10,000 things. And so part of what the text does in conveying this expansiveness and this limitlessness is to use imagery like this, instead of thinking of one Buddha or one thus come one, we're asked to expand the measure of minds, not only to past and to present, but even to future ad infinitum, without beginning or end, and in directions above and below, east and west. 10 directions are called, basically everywhere. The way our mind normally works is that, and again, this is according to this text particularly, is we collapse our consciousness, this vast and expansive consciousness that Hui Neng says has the ability to know profoundly the nature of all things. We collapse that down because of our attachment and our afflictions, and particularly our confined view of who we are as a self contained apart from all these things. When in fact we know not only from this text, but actually from modern science, that doesn't hold up. Regardless, the text is then meant to challenge that, to push on us a little bit. So sometimes when people read and hear this passage, the imagination is challenged. What am I to make of this? And this is part of the intent or purport of this text, is to challenge the collapsed consciousness, to cause it to break out of that sort of paradigm paralysis and expand. Of course, this doesn't happen just by reading this text. The text is just a prompt. The actual ability or return to that expanded consciousness has to come from cultivation of oneself. Basically, the text very simply says, getting rid of greed, anger, and stupidity, and cultivating precept, samadhi, and wisdom. And more importantly, in a very human way, getting rid of our bad habits and character flaws. This most profound state, seemingly out of the reach of the human, is not really out of the reach of the human at all. It's actually an expression of the perfection of the human. That's called, thus come one, Buddha, Bodhisattva, enlightened being. And that's pointing to our capacity as well. And this time, the interlocutor, the person who is taking on the role of speaking in the presence of these Buddhas, is Manjushri, the Bodhisattva of great wisdom. And again, Manjushri is presented in the plural, in the multiple, rather than the singular. And in fact, this could point to a number of things. It could point to things as they really are, that Manjushri is not one being, but a manifestation of deep innate wisdom realized by numerous beings in the past, now happening in the present, and to happen in the future. And so it's not like Manjushri is like my name, Marty, and your name, Alex, but Manjushri is rather an epithet or a title of any being who accomplishes this particularly great expansive wisdom. Then they become Manjushris. Also, it's said at another level, which again stretches our imagination or our powers of consciousness, that when a being perfects this state, not only does the sense, the border or the boundaries of the self disappear or fade away, in the sense melt because they are constructions put up by foolishness and attachment, that the ability to manifest many what are called transformation bodies on the basis of their vows and their compassionate wish to reach out and help, they actually are able to transform into people called incarnations or transformation bodies. I think Huashan is the Chinese for this. This is rather, for most of us, an inconceivable state. Nonetheless, we're asked to consider this as part of the powers or abilities that accrue to someone who has reached this state of unattached, unbound, liberated, no self wisdom. So, wow. In any event, the first verse that Manjushri speaks then tonight is, thus come one is most sovereign. transcending the world. And here it says relies on nothing, but it's almost what this means is, you're going to see this again, it's referring to Zizai. I'm trying to think, is that the Chinese? Yeah, okay, so if we look at the Chinese part that we just recited, Rulai, Zui, Zizai. This is the, Rulai is the thus come one, the one who has come in this way to perfect awakening. What's the Zui? Is that follows, accords? Most. This is exemplary. And then Zizai, literally self-present, if you were to translate it literally. And this is referring to both a general state of being where it conveys the imagery of very relaxed and at ease and, quote, comfortable, not uptight, not afflicted. But it also is a more formal state referring to the ability to accord with conditions and be in the world without being moved or swept off of one's feet. It refers to a kind of relaxed equanimity, if you will. In the midst of all the various things, you're aware, you're alert, you're responding, you're not just pulled back and apathetic. At the same time, you're not thrown off balance. You're not moved or, what's the other word they use? Phased. In other words, tripped up by it. So this Zizai is not a state of remove from the world, of pulling back into a sort of a self-contained meditative withdrawal, but rather it's right in the midst of things, being totally unattached and unbound. Hui Neng in the Platform Sutra says the line is, the one who has this is everywhere engaged but nowhere attached. And that's a wonderful image. And the image of this, one of my favorite anyhow, I went all over Beijing looking for one of these when I was in China. I wanted my particular, I guess this is sort of selfish, but I wanted my particular Guanzizai. Guanzizai is the image you see that embodies this. I don't know if we have a Guanzizai here, do we? Well, I mean an image. We might have a lot of Guanzizais here, but... yeah, Guanzizai is not sitting like in full lotus this way, but rather with one leg up and the arm over the leg and just looking out. It's a perfect image of everywhere engaged, nowhere attached. Responsive, caring, compassionate in the world, but at the same time cool, chilled. Really not flowing with, but responding to. Very different images. So anyhow, I got my Guanzizai finally at the last store in a back alley in Beijing. On the last day I was there, I'd gone for 3 days looking for this Guanzizai. And that's now up at my cottage room at the City of 10,000 Buddhas. But it reminds me of really, and again, the other theme of the Avatamsaka Sutra is not just the state of the nature of the Dharma realm, the understanding, expanding of the Dharma realm, the mind, and all the states, but it's also the best, I think, depiction and elucidation we have of the Bodhisattva path. And chapter after chapter, verse after verse, goes into describing the greatly compassionate, enlightened being who, while enlightening him or herself, enlightens others, and through enlightening others, enlightens him or herself. There's a non-dual reciprocity here. It's not that the Bodhisattva first enlightens him or herself and then commits to enlightening others, but it's happening simultaneously. Reminds me when we first, in the early days in Gold Mountain, the first night I came in, the very first night I came in, I had to speak Dharma. It's, wow. And I had no knowledge of Buddhism. I hadn't studied it really at all, just looked at a couple books maybe about it, never read a sutra. And there on the very first night, the master says, well, here at Gold Mountain, if you eat, if you sleep, if you wear clothes from the monastery, then you have to speak Dharma. One day without Dharma is one day without dinner. So that was a motivating factor to get us to talk. And I can remember that night, I was caught completely off guard. What was I to say? And the master's response was, just say something true. Really wonderful if you think about it. Just say something true. And you say, well, that's not Dharma, that's not Buddhism, that's not Buddha. But actually, if you understand Dharma to be a description of things as they really are, true, then it is. And so Dharma is not necessarily just what we have here in the text. It's words and language and even imagery and even behavior that manifest truth, things as they really are. So that was the first introduction. But in any event, the idea of the Bodhisattva is indefatigable energy to fulfill these vows, to save and rescue, liberate, awaken living beings from all the various destinies. And that's why you have Bodhisattvas portrayed as working among people, working among animals, working in the hells, even in the heavens, all realms where there is a turning and flowing because of greed, anger, and delusion, which keeps that attached ring of becoming, unfortunate becoming, not pleasurable becoming, trying to break out of that. They make these vows to go and to do this without cease. And that's the other inconceivable mind-expanding part of this. You see this in chapter 39 of the Avatamsaka Sutra, where Sudana, the youth, the pure youth, is asking about the Bodhisattva path. And how can I be a Bodhisattva? How do Bodhisattvas cultivate? This is his recurring question. And he's told, well, they make these vast great vows and to rescue living beings. And so it's like, well, how many living beings are there? Well, they're boundless, actually. Wait a minute, boundless. How do I wrap my head around that? Well, they're without number. So then the vows to rescue them would be, duh, he does the math, also without number. And then the time it would take, quote, time being a construction of, limited consciousness, the time it would take to do this is also boundless and limitless. And he kind of loses his breath at this point and going, wow. And on one hand, it seems like it's a bit daunting. But if you really think about it in terms of the Avatamsaka, it's actually liberating. It's liberating in the sense that just chill, don't worry about it. It's no end to this. And you do it because it's worth doing, intrinsically worthwhile. And because you're doing it because it's intrinsically worthwhile, it's just coming from your nature, and there's no beginning and end to this, it becomes zidzai. It becomes very much at ease. And you don't have to worry about then compassion fatigue and all these things that people talk about. Because those fatigues and those weariness have to do with setting goals and expectations and then being frustrated that you don't get them. Whereas if you just make vows, not goals and expectations in that way, then you just roll on following your vows. Anyhow, it's another form of looking at zidzai. Now I lost track of where I was going here. Oh, guan zidzai. So the zidzai there, they translate as without defilement and attachment. No, most sovereign is the word they use. I really don't know that works. I don't know about you when you hear it, because when I hear sovereign, I associate with a king or a majesty sitting on his throne, removed, the sovereign, almost apart from the masses, apart from people. I don't think that's probably, technically it works. Zidzai is sovereign at ease. But sovereign in English to us conveys a power thing. And I think sovereign here is probably not the best translation. We can work on the translation later. I don't want to do that tonight, but I'm just pointing out that if we were to try to get at this directly through translation, we should probably come up with something different than sovereign. And especially there'd be a tendency to capitalize the S. And then we got thus come one and sovereign as in our minds associated with a regal royal power. Now, especially in democracies, that doesn't work very well. We don't like sovereigns. But sovereigns throughout history have had a very checkered past. And so even there, you want to be careful to associate it with a kind of arrogant, above everything, image. That's not what Zudzai means. Zudzai means right in the midst of things. You're a friend, you're a companion, you're there all the time for somebody, and at the same time you're not hitting on them, you're not hooking up, you're not looking for anything whatsoever. And because you don't have any desires and seeking in that way, you can be totally responsive without any messing with folks. So this is Zudzai. That's the meaning here. Then transcends the world, relies on nothing. Basically what that means is he or she is in the world but not of the world. Transcending the world means not caught up in the pettiness of it. It doesn't mean they're beyond the world. It means right within the world, they're not attached. The image sometimes of this one is of Earth Store Bodhisattva, who you see, again, this is the imagery. Buddhist imagery is symbolic. You see the image of Earth Store standing on a lotus flower amidst the fires of the hells. So Earth Store Bodhisattva is in the hells but has transcended the hells because he's not in the hells because of his karma, but there because of the wish to rescue and liberate, even in that really unfortunate realm. So transcendent doesn't mean beyond and gone beyond. It rather means not attached in the here and now. Relies on nothing just means independent, not dependent on other things. This, by the way, is one of the definitions my teacher gave of virtue. Dao De had to do with the image that you are self-sufficient in the best sense of that and not looking and seeking outside to lean on things. There's an independence that comes. And that's, I would say, here relies on nothing would be more like in the American sense, and I'm cautious here, but in the American sense, there's a very positive image of relying on nothing. It's called self-reliance. Now, of course, the problem is with the Buddhists is like, no self, you got a good role. So self-reliance is a virtue. It refers to standing on your own 2 feet, taking yourself for what you have and working with that. I just did this last week with the undergraduates. They were reading Ralph Waldo Emerson and reading his essay called Self-Reliance. And in that essay titled Self-Reliance, when you read it, you realize it's really extolling, in a sense, the independent and energetic and self-responsible impulse that's in the best of us. I think I can remember a line from this because my grandmother made me memorize this when I was a kid. My grandmother was a school teacher in Wisconsin. She was in the first class of women to graduate from the university there, and in keeping with that, most of them became teachers. That was the trade or occupation available to women, and of course nursing. So she became a school teacher, and then upon her graduation, that would have been her father. Graduation gift to her was a horse and a carriage. So she didn't get a Mercedes or something like that. She got this wonderful horse with a single carriage, one-seat carriage, actually with a little surrey around the top. And she would ride that off into Wisconsin to teach at this one-room schoolhouse out in the country. And then she also taught on the local Indian reservation. She was very stern and proper, my grandmother. In the winter, it's really interesting. Now I digress. Bring me back to where I'm going here if I get too lost. But the way you kept warm, and I remember seeing this at our fireplace, was a particular stone that had a hook thing on it. And you would put that in the fireplace until it got really hot. And then you could pull it out with a glove, and you'd slip it into a sleeve of something that was insulated, and then you put that at the bottom of the carriage, and then she would put her feet on top of that. And the warmth from that would keep her warm in Wisconsin going around in a carriage to these schools. So that was a heating, that was a transportation then. Not so zudzai, but it wasn't too bad. Now, where was I going with that? Okay, so my grandmother then decided I was too ragamuffin and mischievous and needed to be cultivated and cultured. And so she had a wonderful library at home. And what she would make me do on Saturdays, I had to go over and scrub her floors. And I had to get down on my hands and knees and scrub her floors with a brush. And she would sit there. She was an invalid because she had been in a car accident But her mind and her mouth were not invalids at all. So she was tapping her cane, pointing to where I needed to scrub and get the floor clean, all the while either making me recite Irish songs protesting the British oppression of the Irish. Yeah, I still remember, I won't bore you with them. And then bits of poetry and whatnot from her library. So in any event, she saw that I was interested in Emerson, so she let me take her book out, and then she said, before I returned it, I had to memorize certain passages. And I really liked Emerson, so I didn't have much time to read. I'm telling you this honestly, I'm not recommending this to you, but I would go to church on Sunday, and we'd have the hymnal, the Bible hymnal, and I would slip my Emerson on the inside of that. So as I was holding my Bible hymnal, the priest looked at me and said, what a good boy, he's reading the Bible and the hymnal. Of course, I was reading Emerson hidden behind the Bible and the hymnal. Okay, so I see if I can remember one of those lines on self-reliance. It goes something like this. And you'll get the flavor of an American version of this relying on nothing in the positive sense, because relying on nothing sort of sounds like almost a bit nihilistic or a bit edgy, when it really means is standing strong in your own person. So self-reliance. It goes something like, there is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance and imitation is suicide, and he must take himself, for better or worse, as his portion. For though the whole universe is filled with good, no kernel of that nourishing corn can come to him except through toil bestowed on that plot of ground given to him to till. The power that resides in him is new in nature, and no one but he knows what it is he can do until he has tried. This is a line from that, but you get the positive feel of that. You worked on the ground that you were given. This is very Buddhist in the sense of where's Bodhi, where's enlightenment? It's right under your feet right now. It's in your person, it's in your life circumstances. You can see this in Hui Nung's verse from the Platform Sutra when he says, do not look for awakening outside your worldly conditions, outside the world. That would be looking like for a rabbit with antlers. It's not there. Bodhi is here in this world. It doesn't mean it is the world, but it's right embedded within. And that's what the Avatamsaka means. Truth and falseness interlink and mingle. It's right in our ordinary lives that the awakening exists. And it's the untangling of the ordinariness of our lives, our relationships with others, our careers, our jobs, and our relationship to ourselves. Untie those knots, and that's awakening. So this transcends, relies on nothing, perfected all merit and virtue. Again, you see how that reliance, that self-reliance, and that unattachedness leads to the accomplishment of merit and virtue. Merit and virtue arises from this self-cultivation. And therefore, I think the last line is you're able to cross over and liberate all realms of existence, meaning beings in all the realms of existence. Master Hua has a wonderful commentary here. I'll just read you this on this line where he deals with zidzai. He says this kind of zidzai means true freedom. He or she is free to roam in self-mastery. Zidzai means that you truly take charge of yourself. You see the correspondence to Emerson here. It also means you don't have any fannao, afflictions, klesha, and that you don't get shaken up or turned by external things. And then he plays off when I was learning Chinese, if I called the monastery for, say, Heng Sure, I learned that I would say, Shi Fa Shi, Zai Bu Zai. Zai Bu Zai. And of course, Master Hua would say, he's not enlightened yet, so he's Bu Zai. If he's enlightened, he's Zu Zai. In any event, so that means there or not there. Zai Bu Zai. You people that know Chinese, that's the way you do it. Master Hua plays off and says, you're always right there. Meaning that you don't run outside. This is a wonderful commentary on it. That's true self-mastery. With no wrong thinking, you will have zudzai, self-mastery. But as soon as you have false thinking, you lose your self-mastery. And without self-mastery, then you run outside and become attached to things and states and become afflicted and worried. There are limitless and boundless things to say about this, and no one could ever finish speaking about this principle. So I could say more, but I think I will pause on this one here and not do the verse part, because there's something else I wanted to do tonight in some of the time that's left. So here's what I've been thinking, and if people are agreeable to this, I will make it a part of the Friday night lecture from now on. Recently, I'm working on, we've just finished a translation of Han Shan De Ching's Wandering in a Dream, and I'm working on an introduction to that. And Han Shan De Ching is roughly about the time of Shakespeare in the Western sense. And very eloquent scholar, monk practitioner, wrote incredible essays and commentaries on sutras and Confucian and Taoist texts and so forth. But he was also an exquisite poet. And he made a comment in the research I was doing that he felt poetry was in some ways better than prose as a vehicle for expressing Dharma. It was very interesting. And so I thought about that, and I was thinking about my teacher, Master Xuanhua, and I would say 80 to 90%, I'd have to check on this, of his writings are poems, are poetry. He did very little prose. The one you translated, Jinchuan, the 10 Dharma realms, not beyond a single thought, that actually has poems in it, now that I think about it. Huh?
Yeah, they're all poems.
They're all poems, but there's commentary too, that's changed into a prose form, but those were poems. So if, the one I know about that he did as prose was Water Mirror Reflecting Heaven. But most of his writing, if you look at his collected poems, and he used to do these at City 10,000 Buddhas of Gold Mountain, just come up spontaneously with a poem and put it on the board. And we really got it fresh. So anyhow, thinking about that, I thought maybe on Friday night I'm just going to add a section of poetry. And so I'm going to start with another Han Shan. So this Han Shan De Ching means silly mountain. This Han is a silly. But there was prior to him in the Tang period a poet hermit, both Buddhist and kind of Taoist figure associated with a kind of deep, fresh poetry tradition called Han Shan, but this is Cold Mountain. So it's different than Silly Mountain. He was earlier. And unlike Han Shan De Ching, he wrote very little. He wasn't involved in church and state politics. He was a hermit and recluse that lived in the mountains, and we know very little about him. We don't know exactly when he was born, who he was born to, what his family did, or even when he died, or what he did for a living prior to becoming this. All we know is that we got some of his poems. So no one knows who he was, when he lived, when he died. As I said, he was a recluse, and he lived in this remote region of the Tiantai mountain range. And his poems were written on rocks, or on bamboo, or wood, or stone on cliffs. I mean, he was sort of graffiti type in that way, that he didn't even write him in paper or books. And so people had to sort of collect these over time, and sometimes he read them on the walls of people's houses. Now, I don't know if he did it as kind of in your face a little bit, or if he did it because they requested a poem and he just did it spontaneously like that. Of the 600 poems he is thought to have written at some point before his death, a little over 300 have been collected and survived, coming down to us today. If I could say a little bit about poetry too here, and this is what Han Shan De Ching was also expressing. He says it's right at the edge of the path and words and language cutoff. In other words, where the path of words and language just starts to fade and cut off, poetry hits that spot and then projects us a little bit beyond that, like fingers pointing to the moon. And poetry has a way of collapsing time and distance. Actually, it can collapse countries and cultures. It speaks to, I think, and from a deeply and widely understood heart of human experience, from human life itself. And so it's very interesting, this Hanshan, the coal mountain I'm talking about, was a place. This coal mountain was a place, but it was also his name. We don't know his family name. He just called himself the same as the mountain where he was. And it's also the title of his poems. So it's a place, it's a person, and it's poems. And I would argue, I think, it's also a state of mind. The famous American poet E.E. Cummings once said of his life, he said, when I was young, I was the child of my parents. That was my identity. I was the son of my father and mother, and I thought through all of that as the relationship of my being. He said, later became my experiences, but finally, I'm just my poems. So towards the end of his life, he said, the poems are me, and I'm my poems. And I think this is true of Hanshan as well. And so the poetry, for me anyhow, and I hope as we do this a little bit Friday night for everybody, it touches and talks to a state of mind. Various feelings that we have at times, almost ineffable, capable of being expression. They're feelings, they're perceptions, they're physical sensations. They can be memories or dreams, reflections, passing shards of images, ideas, intuitions we have throughout our life that resonate with us, that really tell us something about ourselves and the world, but are very hard to put into words or share with others. And yet, when we read a poem and we hit that sensibility, someone's able to express it, immediately we relate to it. And that's why I'd say it collapses time and distance and cultures. It really kind of makes us who we are, not poetry, but these intimations, and what we are just at the edge or even out of the reach of language. And that's why Hanshan felt Chan was so close to this, because the Chan is also described as a mind understanding things directly beyond the path of words and language. And this is also, the path of words and language is cut off. Right in thought, one is without thought. One thinks yet has no thought. This is a Chan verse. Poetry is very close to no thought. It's a language that's barely linked to words, but I would argue it's firmly tied to the heart, or the shin, the mind. So both of these Hanshans, Hanshan De Ching and the Coal Mountain Hanshan, felt poetry best expressed Dharma. And Hanshan De Ching said it best expressed it because real Dharma is not something you can grab and attach to. It's rather pointing to something. And once you get the pointing in the right direction, you have to very importantly not attach to the words and language of it, but let it embody, let it become part of your being. They both also felt that nature, the natural world, and this is why I'm bringing this up, was a mirror to our inner nature, zixing, our self-nature. So the outer world of nature, the trees, the forest, the rivers and streams, the lakes and the ocean, were mirrors to the purity and wholeness and reach and vitality of the essential nature, both literally and figuratively. So poetry is figurative. It is a symbolic language using visceral images that point to things that are literal to us, but hard to express. And as far as the larger nature, which interesting, we now have a monastery in Redwood Forest, which is close to nature, it's called Redwood Vihara, is a place also where you get in touch with your original nature. And this is true, at least throughout much of the Buddhist tradition, throughout Asia, that often the monasteries and temples were located in the remote natural landscape. You know, you have the four mountains of China, Wutai, Zhohua, Puto, and Ome, and they're all in mountainous areas. I mean, it's closest China gets to a national park are its temple monasteries in these mountains. And I think that when we read and listen to these poems, we are reading and listening to our own true self again in a language that's almost musical and elevating. And I think it's important because right now, we are best when we're close to both, close to nature and close to the nature. And we're worst when we're far apart from both of those. And I think as we think about it now, ever more we're in danger of drifting away from both in the modern world. This is the challenge, is to recover the nature, both recover the natural world and recover our own. So I will just share a couple things tonight and get us started. If people are okay with this, I'll just do every Friday night, we'll just do a little more of the poetry. The one I would say right now is, and I'll just read 4 lines from a Western poet called Wordsworth. And Wordsworth was saying at his time already, he felt that humanity was losing its soul and its grounding in buying and selling and shopping and consuming. How much, I mean, that was a few decades ago. And right now, it's even more so. So here's the beginning of his poem. He said, "The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers. Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boom." So he's saying that we're too much with the world is too much with us. In getting and spending, we lay waste to our powers. This is a beautiful definition, by the way, of outflows. Laying waste to our powers. Getting and spending, we outflow and lose our essential energy. And then he says, little we see in nature that is ours. We're so caught up in the material things, in the tube and the devices and the artificial world of our own imaginations, that the natural world, most people don't know what phase the moon is in right now tonight. Well, where it is. Maybe some people don't even know the moon exists. In LA, if you have what's called light pollution, you can go for days, months, years, and never see the night sky. You realize you can grow up, you can be born in Los Angeles if you spend your whole life there, and you can literally not see the night sky ever. You wouldn't even know it existed. So we see little of nature that is ours. And then he says, we've given our hearts away to this, a sordid boon. Boon is something beneficial, helpful. Sordid means dusty, defile. Again, klesha. A sordid boon. It's like a prize that really isn't a prize. Anyhow, that's Wordsworth. Now, I will read 2 poems and then close. And what I'm going to do is going to read one of Cold Mountain's poems, early poems, and you get a feeling for how he was cultivating in nature. And then I'm going to read a contemporary poem that I think shows that Hanshan's sentiments and what he was engaged in is universal and timeless. And the second poem is written by a poet who just died a few years ago. So here's the first poem from Cold Mountain. He says, I settled at Cold Mountain long ago. Already it seems like years and years. Freely drifting, I prowl the woods and streams and linger watching things themselves. Men don't get far into this mountain. White clouds gather and billow, thin grass does for a mattress. The blue sky makes a good quilt. Happy with a stone under head, let heaven and earth go about their changes. So this is the beginning poems of Cold Mountain. It's really quite beautiful. But basically, he's taking nature, the ground, the sky, the natural elements as his home and his bed. A very important key line here is I linger watching things in itself. This is Zai. I watch things as they are. I don't interfere. I don't have desires or designs over them. This is that relaxed presence. Okay. And I would encourage you, I'll just keep going, but if people have poems they want to send me along these lines, please send them and I'll see. We might include them. And I'm hoping somewhere maybe someone would do the Chinese for the Hanshan, because I have it, and transcribe it. Could that be done online? Yeah, so then people could actually look at the Chinese and get engaged with the translation, but not tonight. We'll just think about that for the next class. Anyway, now in relation to that, I'm going to read the modern poem, and this is by a American woman poet, Mary Oliver. And she too is talking about her immersion in nature, and here's how it goes. I thought the earth remembered me. She took me back so tenderly, arranging her dark skirts, her pockets, full of lichen and seeds. I slept as never before, a stone on the riverbed. See the parallel to Anshan? Nothing between me and the white fire of the stars. But my thoughts, and they floated light as moths among the branches of the perfect trees. All night I heard the small kingdoms breathing around me. Again, imagery to Avatamsaka, the small kingdoms, worlds within worlds. I heard the small kingdoms breathing around me, the insects and the birds who do their work in the darkness. All night I rose and fell as if in water, grappling with a luminous doom. By morning, I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better. By morning, I had vanished. Immersing myself in nature, I had vanished at least a dozen times into something better. This, to me, also conveys the positive side of anatta, of no self. I had vanished into something better. So anatta is not the extinction of one's being, but rather the release and expansion of it into something better. So anyhow, I really, myself, really enjoy the poetry, the poetic sensibility, and so if nobody minds, and even if you do mind, I'm going to keep doing it. A little poetry every week here for the class. So I'll stop here tonight. I should say that next Friday is going to be our last class for the semester, and then we're on summer break. So we'll go back into this text, do a little poetry, and then pick up again at the end of summer. Junwei, are you going to? I'm sorry, Jinchuan, are you going to? Okay. Oh, do you need this? Oh, okay, let me take it off so I don't interrupt.
So as Marty was talking about the Chinese word zizai, I thought of a story that for me really kind of embodies this principle. I think in general in BTTS we've been translating zizai as effortless self-mastery, which gets a little bit of that flavor of you're completely at ease and you're completely composed and able to take care of whatever's around us without any problems. Maybe it could be something like a relaxed presence, because you actually zi is self and zai is at, so you're fully present. You're fully here for what's going on. And so the story is someone who's really respected in the service-based community named Arun Dada, and he actually came to visit the 10,000 Buddhas in DRBU, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago. And only later did I kind of find out more about him and some of the stories associated with him. There's one story that just, when I heard it, kind of really changed my perspective of things. And the Poon tells us that he was 19 years old and he seriously dislocated his jaw. And so he needed to get some work on his mouth to fix his jaw and his teeth. So the dentist actually wanted to give him general anesthesia. And he said, no. He said, really? This is really painful. He says, no. He says, I don't know, we can't take, you have to anesthesia. He says, I'll make a deal. If I make any noise at all or flinch at all, you can give me anesthesia. He said, okay. So they start to, drill into his mouth and put in a pin and not a flinch. So they keep going. They finish the surgery. They're like, whoa. Right? And later, 3 months later, they take it out and same thing. So they ask him, what do you have against anesthesia? And his response was, I accept whatever nature gives me. I accept whatever nature gives me. And I thought, wow. It's just an interesting perspective shift where, we can have this aversion to pain and then kind of fight it and try to be tough through it. But he just actually relaxes into it and fully accepts it. Whatever nature gives me. Just like what Marty was talking about. Whatever arises, I just fully accept. And it's interesting when they ask him about his life, he said much of his life was just exploring the limits of pain and seeing that it's actually empty at the end. There's nothing to fear. And so I just remember that story as a story of actual real zizai. When he came to the 16,000 Buddhas, now upon reflection, now knowing a little bit more about him, he's just a very, very humble elder. Just kind of gave a little talk on the nature of fear and shared some prayers that was actually deeply moving. And it just, to me, is an embodiment of what it means to be completely at ease, completely present. So, yeah.
Do not try this.
Yeah, I wouldn't try it though. I definitely would be going for a little anesthesia. Yeah. Okay. Oh, you have to use your mic again. Wait a second.
Oh, do I need to use it?
Yeah. Otherwise, I can't hear you.
Okay. Here?
Yeah.
I forgot to mention that, in the verse leading up to tonight, it said, Manjushris spoke this verse. Actually, Hanshan Ko Mountain was considered stories to be the incarnation or embodiment of Manjushri Bodhisattva. So it's very interesting. Manjushri spoke this verse in the Avatamsaka, but he's associated with Hanshan Ko Mountain. And so in a sense, the idea is that the verses we're getting in this poetry are actually the words and verses of Manjushri Bodhisattva. Oh, it's interesting, I forgot. Next week I'll tell the story about Hanshan and Sure.
Oh, yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a really good one. Okay. Let's do the transcript.
Yeah, they weren't too accepted in the monastery. Should I get a mask? Okay, we do dedication of merit. May every living being, our minds as one and radiant with light, share the fruits of peace with hearts of goodness, luminous and bright. If people hear and see how hands and hearts can find in giving unity, may our minds awake to great compassion, wisdom, and to joy. May kindness find reward. May all who sorrow leave their grief and pain. May this boundless light dispel the darkness of our endless night. Because our hearts are one, This world of pain turns into paradise. May all become compassionate and wise. May all become compassionate and wise. Bow in respect to the three jewels.